Hello friends, welcome to my today's audio tutorial. Today's audio tutorial relates with the Charter Act of 1853. My name is Harshit Dwivedi and I again welcome you to this tutorial. The previous tutorial was of Charter Act of 1833. However, 20 years have passed. So, Charter Act of 1833 was due to be reviewed. It was on the verge of expiration. So, the Charter Act of 1853 was released. However, we can say that not very big changes were made in the Charter Act of 1853 when we compare it to the regulations of Charter Act of 1833. Some changes were made, but we cannot say that those changes were very huge. So, in this, the very first thing that was done, that the number of directors of the company were reduced from 24 to 18. Previously, the strength of the court of directors were 24. Now, it was reduced to 18. And out of these 18, 6 directors were to be appointed by the Crown. Now, the point is, by doing this, British government almost had total control on the administration of the company by appointing 1/3 of its member in the court of directors. It was also the last of the series of charter acts that were passed by the British Parliament until 1853. After 5 years after 1853, in 1857, Supply Mutiny occurred in India. That is also famous as the first war of independence of the Indians. One thing we Indians are very proud of. So coming back to Charter Act of 1853, I will tell you the first very important characteristic of Charter Act of 1853. In this act, for the very first time, legislative domain was separated from the executive domain. It means that legislative functions were demarcated from the executive functions. Now, this thing will come in our mind that what is this? So, there was a council which we know as the Governor General's Council. In this Charter Act, the Governor General's Council's functions were divided into two types of functions. One was legislative functions, the second was executive functions. So, through this Charter Act, the Executive Council and Legislative Councils were formed. Now, through this Charter Act, 6 new members were added to the Legislative Council and they were known as Legislative Councillors. The Governor General's Legislative Council was also known as Indian Central Legislative Council. This council functioned in the same manner and with the same procedure as the British Parliament functions. Thus, through this act, for the first time, legislation was being treated as a special organ or function of the government, which was done in a proper and pre-directed way. Now, the appointment of 6 members to the Indian Central Legislative Council was done with the objective of giving local representation, that is, representation and chance to the people of India to participate in the decision making and legislation process of their country. So, because of this, of the 6 new legislative members of the Governor General's Councils, 4 members were appointed by the local provincial governments of Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and Agra. So, the most important change of this act was that the executive functions and the legislative functions of the Governor General's Council were separated, and the Legislative Council of the Governor General's Council, 6 new members were added, and out of those 6 new members, 4 members were appointed by the local provincial governments of Madras, Bengal, Bombay, and Agra. Second important feature of Charter Act of 1853. Through this act, an open competition system of selection of civil servants was started. For this, the Macaulay Committee, that was also known as the Committee on the Indian Civil Services, was appointed in 1854. The functions of this committee was to lay down the guidelines and provisions according to which all India services can be started through a competition. The competition was thrown open in 1854. In this competition, Indians were also allowed to appear, and from then onwards, Indians were given a chance to participate in the decision making of the government. In 1833, when the system of open competition was for the first time proposed, it was being negated because of the opposition from the Court of Directors. But this time, in spite of the opposition, this open competition system for the recruitment of civil servants was established. Third most important feature of the Charter Act of 1853. The rule of the East India Company was extended, but no definite period of the functioning of East India Company was defined in the Charter Act of 1853, unlike the previous Charter Acts. This means that in the previous Charter Acts, it was being told that the company's territories or the British possessions in India will be administered by the East India Company for this much time period, but in Charter Act of 1853, no such time period was being told. So it was clear that the company rules can be terminated at any point of time by the British Parliament. So now the services of the East India Company were not permanent and they can be terminated at any time by the British Parliament. So these 3 features were the most important features of the Charter Act of 1853. I will sum up all these features in detail in a quick manner. It separated the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. Legislative Council was separately made. 6 new members were appointed to this Legislative Council, which were also known as Legislative Councillors, and out of these 6 members, 4 members were appointed from the local provincial governments of Madras, Bombay, Agra, and Bengal. Second most important point, a system of open competition for the recruitment of civil services was thrown open, and for that and for laying down the provisions of that system, Macaulay Committee was formed in 1854. Third most important feature was that this Charter Act extended the rule of the company on trust of the British Crown, but it did not define any specific time period for which the company had to operate. The time limit of the operation of the company was defined in previous Charter Acts, but in this Charter Acts, no such time limit was defined. So, it was clear that the services of the East India Company can at any point of time be terminated by the British Parliament. So with this, we wrap up our discussion of Charter Act of 1853. In my next lecture, I will take up Government of India Act of 1858. My name is Harshit Dwivedi, and thank you for listening this audio tutorial.